Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to those of you that have joined us before, and to anybody joining us for the first time. We're very pleased to have you. My name is Damian Douglas. I'm president of the World Media Group. I'm also a EMEA managing director at Time. Today's discussion will centre around innovation within the media industry, and Gordana will introduce both this subject and our panel very shortly. I just wanted to intro the topic and do a little around housekeeping. So, as by way of quick intro, the pace of digital transformation will continue to accelerate across many sectors. Our titles have written about that for the last 18 months plus. Over the last 18 months, we've experienced around 6 years worth of change and transition in a very short period of time. And the proliferation of data has changed the way we operate indefinitely. So look, the pandemic has forced us to evolve, and fundamentally, we are different now to what we were when we entered. Equally, our core values remain the same. Words like truth, trust, integrity, and value don't tend to come and go. You work very hard to earn them, and you work doubly hard to keep them. So our biggest challenge is maintaining relevance, and innovation is integral to this. So without further ado, I want to advise anybody that wants to tweet to use the hashtag WMG Media Innovation, and you will see a poll on your screen. So please do participate in this, and we'll come back to it at the end. The question is, where do you find inspiration for your most innovative or creative ideas? But without further ado, I'll hand over to Gordana to take you through both the discussion and the panel. So Gordana, all yours.
Thank you, Damian. And hi, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of World Media Group Live Panel Discussion. Well, as always, thank you for dialing in from wherever you are, whether you are from your home office or if you're lucky, maybe from your work office too. So there's a lot to unpack in the next hour. And before I get started, I just want to highlight a couple of housekeeping details. A recording of the show will be available on World Media Group page after the show. And also we are doing a Q&A on WMG Live. So add your questions in the comments and we will try to answer as many as possible. So today's topic, as Damian said, is a media innovation, maintaining the momentum post-COVID. I have prepared quite a few questions for our esteemed panel today, but before I turn to them for answers, it's worth reminding ourselves of our current professional conditions. Of course, I'm talking about the COVID pandemic. Well, the pandemic taught us an important lesson, and this is that urgency spurs innovation. We witnessed firsthand some of the key principles of great innovation in action. Basically, move fast and remove barriers. So if you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, COVID-19 researchers were, for instance, unable to gain the access to different strands of health service data. And once the government has raised those restrictions on existing data and actually allowed researchers to ask people who had tested positive for COVID-19 to join those trials, we saw that what happened. Basically, removing those barriers was crucial to the success of producing vaccine in a record time. So the same principle really resonates strongly in innovation in media. So when communities across the world wanted to make sense of what was actually happening to us last year, they turned to World Media Group platforms for those information. And the publishers and brands had to quickly reevaluate their operational and production processes. So editorial teams were able to deliver impact journalism at the scale throughout the new formats in innovative media delivery solutions. But as we all know, when we talk about media innovations, it's actually quite loaded terms that comes with all sorts of assumptions. It usually implies new things. It implies new products, new solutions, new services. And actually, very often that's what it delivers, but not always. I can tell you from the agency perspective, we at Harvard spend a lot of time thinking and advising our clients about what actually innovation looks like through the lens of the new operating model and meaningful media, using the media as a driver for growth. So this essentially not necessarily resulted in new things. Instead, our focus went into innovating in the space of what we call structural experimentation or incremental innovation. essentially what that means is a building on the great solutions that already existed and connecting a part of the organization that otherwise worked in silos. So one thing is certain here is that innovation is considered as major source of economic growth, and the results of innovation should always be an improvement. So I guess this is a kind of a challenge for all of us today, is how do we actually keep the flames of innovation burning long term rather than relying on one-off genius solutions to spur the growth. So there is a lot to unpack in the next hour. So let me start. So let me introduce you to my first panelist, Liam Brennan. Liam is a global director of innovation at the Mediacom. He is helping to develop and deliver business and digital transformation agenda for some of the Mediacom's largest clients through the use of data technology and startups as a part of the Blink consulting team. Welcome, Liam.
Hi, Gordana. Lovely to meet everyone virtually.
Nice to get you on the panel. So, Liam, there are many innovations in the media that have appeared during the pandemic and that some brands weren't really ready for. So we talk about the gaming, huge rise in e-commerce and the streaming. I want to ask you a question. What is your perspective on this? Do you think that these trends will stick post-pandemic? What else is on the horizon that we still haven't seen or accounted for? And how do brands prepare for these ongoing disruptions? I ask you 3 questions, I realize. So you can start from the top.
That's all right. I'll work my way through. So I think, I'll give you a very wishy-washy answer that some of it will stick and some of it won't. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail. I've got a little short presentation. I'll talk everyone through. But certainly, I think what you'll see is that once normality comes back, people will sort of move back to the behavior that was the easiest or the most convenient for them. And when you look at something like e-commerce, I think what you'll see, particularly like where I'm sitting in London, the UK, that's been something that's really stuck. But it hasn't necessarily stuck everywhere else. And I think that's because often it's easier to go to a shop and buy stuff with your hands. But you'll see sometimes actually it's more convenient. I think when you think about what's next, and it's not as an exciting an answer as maybe what people want to hear, but we are going to be entering into a sort of economically challenging time. And thinking back to, say, 2008, there might be some new technologies, there might be some new things that come along. We'll probably see some people continue some of their behaviors from the pandemic. But what will really, I think, change things in the next 12 to 18 months is actually what's the impact going to be on people's wallets? And will people start doing things differently because they're either trying to save money or extract more value? So, for example, does streaming become less of a question of lots of content I can watch because I've got nothing else to watch, or is it a cheaper way to entertain the kids versus taking them to the cinema? And I think these are interesting questions brands should be asking themselves. How should they start? Well, it's really hard to predict what's going to come around the corner, but I think the pandemic, all the things that sort of blew up in the pandemic, didn't come out of nowhere. They've been there for a couple of years, bubbling in the background. So it's really important that brands understand who they're trying to talk to and their audience and how they're behaving. And if you get a really good steer on that, you can kind of be better prepared for what's coming down the pipeline. And if you know where your business is heading and what makes the most sense from a selling the product, advertising the product perspective, and if that changes overnight, you're much better prepared by thinking in advance rather than just reacting as things happen and acting 3 months later. Great.
And Liam, to that point, so how would you advise the brands where the focus therefore needs to be in this sort of the ongoing innovation and transformational agenda that we are kind of pursuing with our clients and the brands?
I think it's so important to be business focused when it comes to innovation. So much innovation is just fluffy, and it gets you lots of PR. And whenever you scale through any of the industry press titles, you see lots of really great press releases about brands doing big partnerships with gaming platforms or on-demand delivery and things like that. And that's all fantastic. But if you're not improving the business bottom line, then it's a waste of time. And I think what's certainly my fear for the year is going to be that brands latch onto trends from last year or the bright and shiny things without thinking about, is this actually where I should be focusing my time and energy in terms of growing my bottom line? It's good to experiment and it's good to try new things, but only be doing that if that's where your product is being sold, where your audience is consuming media, or is an area where there's a sort of increased demand for a different type of product from you. I look specifically at things like on-demand delivery, where massive explosion of on-demand delivery during the pandemic. But once we can all go back to restaurants, are we really all going to be ordering all of our food on demand?
Yes. Thank you, Liam. So, your point about this sort of looking for, when you think about innovation, think it's a good to experiment, but look where your customers are, where the next big place is becoming increasingly important in terms of focus.
100%.
Great, thank you. On the point of need for a deeper organizational transformation and creating the deeper links internally, I think it's over to Leila now. Really, let me introduce you to another practitioner in this field, Leila Bolton. After a series of editorial roles at the FT, from foreign correspondent to digital innovation, Leila recently took up a newly created hybrid role as a development editor for FT Live and senior editor at the Financial Times. Hi, Leila, welcome.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you on board. Leila, FT events have a long tradition of success, but in February 2020, you had to completely reinvent the business, and you came straight out an enormous conference with thousands of participants in March. This was long before most businesses had even started thinking about going viral. How were you able to do that? Because in hindsight, it was incredibly brave.
Well, I like to talk about the 3 S's. Talk about a reset. Imagine a business that had never done a digital event ever, and it faced the prospect of collapse. These 3 S's are survival, speed, and solidarity. And if I take the first one, survival, that's what our business, our events business faced, and also what our newly minted managing director of FT Live faced, the demise of his shiny new career at the FT, which he joined only a few months earlier. So he knew, along with colleagues, that a speedy response was also essential to show everyone that the FT was still in the market and still in the game. And then that's where the 3rd S kicks in, of solidarity. The FT has an amazing culture where people pull together in an emergency. And they are also very entrepreneurial. I think most people at the FT nowadays understand that to be a credible business newspaper, you need to be a credible business yourself. And so there were great ideas coming in from around the business on how we could keep different parts of the FT going. Obviously, the news kept itself going with the biggest story of our recent past. But we also needed a proposition for events. And the idea of doing a digital event was a pretty obvious one to do. But where the boldness came into it was to do a really big event, one that would really capture people's imagination. And so Orson and his colleagues, advised also by TNW, the tech events business that the FT had recently acquired, decided to launch a big event. But they didn't have any of the tools to do one. So the first thing to do was to acquire a digital platform, which Orson and his colleagues proceeded to do bypassing the FT's rather slow-moving procurement system to get one quickly, we invited Martin Wolf to host a test event on the effects of the economic emergency stemming from the pandemic. And we were able, in the space of 3 days, to market a test event starring Martin Wolf. And when we got 6,000 registrations for this April Fool's Day event, we knew that this was not a joke and that we had something that we could work with. And I want to add 2 more special ingredients to those 3 S's. One is the amazing convening power of the FT as a brand. And the second is the talent of our journalists in creating these uniquely intelligent, clever, and really compelling events for our audience. We had this successful event with Martin Wolf's name on the invitation. The panelists we invited immediately agreed to take part. And 6 weeks later, on May 15, we saw the launch of the Global Boardroom, which not only had 120 speakers over 3 days, but attracted 52,000 registrations. Now, 52,000 registrations was double the total number of attendees to our events for the whole of 2019. Think about it. And that's how the story of this success unfolded.
That's impressive. So, Leila, what's next for FT events? How are you going to ensure you continue to innovate and that you're going to actually, the focus that you put on connecting all these different parts of the organization to work together to produce such a huge event and gather such a huge audiences? Is there anything left to conquer?
Well, I have only to quote what our editor, Rula Khalaf, said last week at a town hall. She said, if we stop innovating, we'll lose our competitive edge. So the first thing for us to look forward to is the continuation of this rather remarkable culture that I described earlier. As Drucker, the management thinker, said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, in the FT's case, this is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is so important. I cannot stress it enough. Some of our best products for our subscribers were the ideas of FT journalists. And this includes our Weekend FT Festival, which is going to be our first hybrid event on the 4th of September at Kenwood House. Where every year we gather loyal FT readers with some of the greatest minds in the world to talk to our journalists. And this is going to be all the richer because we'll be able to retain the global audience that we attracted during the pandemic, all the people who won't be traveling, alongside the sort of fireworks of the more traditional live events. So alongside all of this, razzmatazz that we're all experimenting with concerning hybrid events, I think the behind the scenes work and innovation is also going to be very important. The creation of my role is a very good example of that. It's a hybrid straddling FT Live and editorial. So I have 2 bosses. One is Orson, and the other is an assistant editor on editorial. And the aim of this role is to build more and more bridges and connections between FT Live and editorial, while guarding the editorial integrity, which makes our journalism stand out. even when it's supported by advertising and sponsorship. And so with that guiding principle of editorial integrity comes also scope for greater editorial involvement and input into events. And as I said, some of our best ideas have come from our journalists. And so this means that instead of FT Live talking to individual journalists to plan each event as they go along to decide whom we're going to invite and what we're going to talk about, we're also, as editorial, going to have more input into the kinds of topics that we cover in events and the kinds of combinations that we can offer both our audience and our sponsors and advertisers. So, and I have a lot of experience of both sides of the business, which is why they gave me this job. Before taking on this role in February, I ran our special reports department, which is advertising-backed journalism on topics of interest to FT readers. And so I have a lot of experience in saying no to advertisers, commercial colleagues, and journalist colleagues alike. And so basically, when I'm asked about something, a commercial proposition, I have two questions. One is, what will it do for our audience? Will it help them? Will it delight them? If the answer is yes, perfect. The second question is, what will this do to our brand? Will it hurt our brand and our reputation? If the answer is yes, no, we turn stuff down, even if it means turning down large amounts of money. A lot of people I just want to say one more thing. I mean, a lot of people in the media business think that events are there to generate revenues to support journalism. I and many of my colleagues think differently, that events are a new kind of journalism. And you only have to watch our editor ask a business leader some tough probing questions to understand that the chemistry of a live event is something that can't be captured by the written word. Yeah. And so there's a lot of opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Leila. We'll be discussing this a little bit later on the panel discussion. I want to go back briefly to Liam to talking about navigating the helping the brands in this journey. Liam, you shared something. You want to share something that you kind of have a very healthy perspective on.
Yeah, thanks, Gordana. Yes, I've got a little short presentation just to talk everyone through, just to help brands sort of navigate the next 6 months or so. I'm hoping everyone can see that on their screen now. So, as I mentioned earlier on, the pandemic was something that really caused a big acceleration of transformation, digital transformation. And I don't think it's a surprise for anyone to hear that things like streaming grew, e-commerce grew, and gaming grew during the pandemic. We all know these trends. But I think what's really interesting about this is actually these aren't new trends. They've actually been around for a while and they've been growing in the background. And really what they are is more of a digitalization of existing behaviors. And it caused mostly by people actually not being able to carry out the norm. So for example, the growth in streaming services was something that had been brewing for a long time. I myself am a subscriber of many of these services. But the reason why they grew during the pandemic is because people spent more time at home and they needed more content to watch, particularly those with families. So the more content they needed, the ability to time shift meant streaming became a very interesting option for most people. The digitization of commerce. Stores were shut for a large period of the pandemic. So actually going and buying things in physical retail was basically impossible. So it's no surprise the percentage of sales that things like e-commerce grew. Obviously, you've got things like fears of the virus too, and the ability to time shift. So that was a big impact in actually the growth of e-commerce. And lastly, things like gaming are more about the digitalization of activities. So again, gaming was quite big, but if you can't go outside, you can't mix with others. And indeed, particularly with sports, you can't go and play sports, you can't go and watch sports. That was a big shift in consumption towards gaming. It's something we saw in MediaCom, we carried out some research last year, and so the biggest audience shift into gaming came from people that were using sports apps. So there's nothing on TV to watch in terms of sports. You go and play FIFA instead. So that's not just to dismiss these trends and say, actually, this is all nothing. We should just move on from this. It's actually really a wake-up call for brands to say, we should be paying more attention to some of the things that are bubbling in the background, because the brands succeeded in 2020 and indeed the first half of 2021 weren't necessarily brands that sort of threw everything out the window in mid-March and then pivoted into these three areas. They were brands that were prepared for this. They've been trialing things beforehand. They've been learning how they worked. And I love this image of 2021, the timeline of the year, because to me, it feels a little bit like we're about to go back to March 20 again and see what was bubbling then and start from there. There will probably be some things that will stick, of course, that I mentioned before, but actually there'll be a lot of things that we've missed, that we haven't been able to do. And there might be some things that actually we have found that are slightly better, but really it's a big reset back to early 2020. And we should probably be paying more attention to actually what people were doing back then bubbling in the background and start thinking about how do we plan for that? What do we do differently? The two examples I like to use in sort of that reversion to the norm are cinema and e-commerce. Now, I've not been back into a cinema since about February 2020, and it's not because I don't like cinemas. They've been open. This has been nothing to watch. And I think you're not going to see everyone instantly stop going to the cinema once things reopen again, because there'll be great films like the James Bond films. There'll be new Marvel films coming out. There'll be new comedies and tons of really great content actually coming out that has been backlogged, that have been unable to show. And so it won't be that everyone's going to give up on cinema because they haven't been doing it for 18 months. Rather, cinema will be back and people will want to go and watch stuff. But then look at something like e-commerce. And this is a chart on the right-hand side from the Office of National Statistics in the UK that shows the growth of e-commerce across what we call addressable retail and also groceries. So e-commerce and grocery has been very small for a long time, still remains very small. But in terms of a non-addressable retail, that's things like going and buying clothes, buying big box items. E-commerce has been growing for a long time. And even when the lockdowns finished, there was a little bit of a bounce back, but things stayed pretty high. And I think there will be certain things that people have gone, actually, I really wanted to try this for a long time, and I finally had a chance to try it. And actually, I quite prefer it to the norm. But as you can see there as well, even though e-commerce in grocery has doubled from a base of 5% to 10%, that still means 90% of people aren't shopping online for their groceries. So it's important to be aware of what's changing, but it's also to be aware of what is not changing. And don't massively pivot just because the growth of something has grown so far. There's absolutes to these growth numbers. And I think it's really important, I talked before about understanding the consumer, is that don't predict the future based on what's happened in the past. Especially if you're into kind of investing, you never look at the last month. You look at the last few years and where things are going. But also you need to understand the differences between people across markets and actually what are the market forces growing. And I showed the e-commerce sites before from the UK, a very, very different story when you look at other markets. Look at the US, for example, right? E-commerce sales definitely grew, and you can see that red line going up. But as soon as the lockdown's finished and things start to get somewhat back to normal, they've grown a little bit from the norm, but not massively so, nowhere near as much as the UK. And I think that is because in America, the offerings aren't as strong. The supermarkets in the US have not done as good a job as supermarkets in the UK about modernizing their e-commerce offering, but also Americans love click and collect. They like to take their cars and drive down to the Walmart, drive down to Trader Joe's and pick up their food rather than having it delivered to their house. So for them, that behavior is something that dominates in that market. It doesn't necessarily dominate in the UK. You can't take one learning and apply it elsewhere. In Spain, e-commerce sales went down during the pandemic, which is really weird. I wasn't expecting that, but that's because there's a distrust in distribution and a distrust in couriers in Spain. So always look at what the consumer's doing. Don't take trends at face value in various marketing titles. Really look under the skin of actually what is going on and why people are doing what they're doing. If you want to look forward, understand the motivations for why people changed, but also understand when they had no other option to do what they need to do. My last slide quickly, my hopeful trend for the year is actually brands take advantage of new real-time data signals and act on it. And this is a brand that we have at MediaCom that sells apparel. And on the first day, obviously, they have physical stores and they have an online presence. And what happened was the first day when the lockdowns were announced in Europe, They were able to see all their search data and sales data for different activities. So when people are doing some sort of leisure or sport or going out, and also certain products, and they examined the uplift in sales and the uplift in searches for those certain products, and they pivoted their creative messaging, and they pivoted where those ads were driving to. This all happened in a very short amount of time when the pandemic was announced. These are the sort of pivots the brands were able to make because they were better prepared for when things like this happen, because they had access to the information. So even though we'll talk a lot about data this year, we'll talk about first-party data and cookieless world and all these things, just being able to understand behavioral changes in real time has a lot of value, and brands should be focused on unlocking that so they can act quicker in the future for when things change, whether for the better or hopefully not for the worse. So hopefully that's a little quick presentation, little taster, and gets people a little bit excited about where we could go this year and what might actually be big or what might not be big.
Great, thank you, Liam. Just a reminder for everybody that there is a button on the World Media Group to ask your questions, and keep them coming, please. So thank you, Liam. So moving on a slightly different subject. As a media practitioner, we spend a lot of time thinking and debating the most effective and engaging ways of creating the connections with Gen Z. And I've asked Kevin Young, the Economist Head of Audiences, to join us today. Hi, and welcome, Kevin.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. I wanted to start with a bit of a provocative question, if you don't mind. I hope you don't mind me saying that, but some might perceive The Economist having a traditional approach to media. However, for quite a number of years now, you had a very active social content strategy to engage with a potential Gen Z subscriber. So, and I've seen that you won recently some big awards for that as well. Congratulations. My question to you is, what led you to innovate in that way, and what do you see in terms of success in the conversion levels to paying subscribers? And how have you actually adapted your content to Gen Z audiences?
Thank you very much for your congratulations. Yes, you're right that The Economist won the best use of social media at the International News Media Association's awards very recently, and we were delighted about that. That was for our US elections coverage. So I have been at The Economist for 2 years. Previously, I was at the BBC for 15 years and Bloomberg for 4 years. And reaching new audiences was a really big part of my past decade, basically, in those two roles, and also the time that I've spent at The Economist. I think The Economist particularly, we are one of the most famous news organizations in the world. We've been around since 1843. We have dipped our toes into the digital world in the last decade, and really now we have a digital first strategy. And so unless we have people coming through to our website and building a long-term relationship with us and then becoming subscribers, we don't have a business model. We have other parts of the Economist Group that focus on events, focus on advertising, marketing, but really the core aspect of the brand is the editorial operation in terms of the heritage that we have had for nearly 200 years. So when I arrived 2 years ago, we completely overhauled our approach to social media. We took a different strategy for each of the two main platforms that we were running, Twitter and Facebook. And then we decided to look at Instagram, which had historically been a photo-led account, which was a very big thing, in the first half of the 2010s. And we realized that Instagram could become a shop window for all of the fantastic visual journalism that we have. And we have charts, we have videos, we have illustrations. All of these were kind of sitting on the printed page. They were visible to people who bought a newspaper, as we call it, or magazine version of The Economist, but they weren't being seen by the millions of followers that we had on social media. And so we have adopted an approach where we have beautiful templates. We have a standardized way of working now across our social team in order to have kind of templates. We have different visual approaches that we can draw upon. And we've also expanded the skill set of people who work on our social team so that everybody can handle everything, rather than having one person being the absolute focus of something. And that means that we can use platforms like Instagram, not just for pretty photos anymore, but for all of our visual journalism. It's a particularly important platform for us because 2/3 of our 5.5 million followers are aged 18 to 34. So that means that 3.5 million people have a regular relationship with The Economist on that platform. And in the past 2 years, to conclude my answer, Gordana, the Instagram platform has gone from delivering no referrals a month to our website to delivering 1 million to our website, economist.com. And it's now the biggest generator of subscriptions for any social platform that we have. And so that's a spectacular rise from 0 to be number 1. And if you're talking about reaching the next generation of subscribers or building a long-term relationship with different audiences, then a place where we have 3.5 million people who consume our content between the ages of 18 and 34, and another 2 million of different age groups who also see that material, Instagram really is key for us.
Kevin, so that's great, but what have you had to do? Like we talked about the structural changes that Leila was talking about, the way how FTA is organized. And we talked about through the lens of the brand. What did you have to do to be more adaptive? Did you have to the strategy of the maybe the talent and investing in a tech? What's behind that in Economist?
Well, first of all, it was important to crowdsource resourcing from around our newsroom. So we have we're very fortunate, we have a social team of 9 people based in the UK and in North America. But around the Economist newsroom, we have many times 9 people who work on illustrations or who are picture editors or who are data journalists or video producers. And so what we did was we basically offered the opportunity for them to showcase more of their work. And people, if you ask them to do something new, they might be a little bit reluctant at first. But if you say to an illustrator, your work is seen on the paper, we have 5 million Instagram followers who could see it. Would you like your work to be seen by 5 million people on their phones every week? And most people are not going to say no to that. And it was the same kind of approach to try and standardize some of our data journalism so it looked beautiful for what they call the thumb-stopping audiences, people who are scrolling through on their phones and have only a second or two to make up their mind about whether they're interested. But also in terms of processes, I mentioned, and when I spoke a couple of minutes ago, we standardized a lot of our templates, our different approaches to the visual side of the production process. A year and a quarter ago, we all went remote. We've been producing The Economist remotely ever since. And I suppose in 2020, one of my instincts was to democratize all of these processes to make sure that if several members of the team fell ill and we were running a skeleton staff, that we wouldn't be compromised in terms of the output that we were producing. The upside of that, fortunately, we didn't have any serious illness on our team, and now everybody is able to muck in and get stuck into all the different processes. And we have a lot of enthusiasm around the newsroom. Winning an award, I think, is wonderful, but it's also important to remember that lots and lots of people were involved in that. And when you share the processes and share the work, means that people can also share in the success afterwards as well.
Well, it obviously worked. So well done. Thank you, Kevin. So kind of moving on from the publishers to a broadcaster. So we know that as a consumer and ad revenue transition from traditional TV to streaming services, media organizations obviously need to continue to innovate too. So we also see the way that news is delivered has not fully adapted to the cord-cutting streaming and social world that we are currently living in. So the big question here is, how do traditional broadcasters news model delivers to global stories to this new generation of the rising leaders and professionals? So very pleased to say hello and welcome to Jean Ellen. Jean is GM of Bloomberg Quick Take and Global Head of Strategy and Business Development at Bloomberg Media. So Jean, hi, first of all.
Hi, wonderful.
Lovely to have you on this panel. I would like to start by asking you a question. As somebody who was deeply involved with the Bloomberg launch of Quick Take in 2017, and for the uninitiated, could you describe what is it and why did you do it?
Absolutely. So yes, we launched Quick Take at the very end of 2017. initially, it was a unique partnership with Twitter. So we were the first 24/7 global news network specifically designed for Twitter. And we were pushing out kind of news videos around the clock on everything that was happening around the world. So that was really 2018. And the easy way to think about Quick Take is 2018, we were on Twitter. 2019, we expanded to other social platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. And then 2020, through the pandemic, we launched our streaming channel. So we expanded to longer form video content, including documentary series, and also launched our full 24/7 streaming channel, which is continuing to expand across various streaming platforms. And the goal of Quick Take is really to be a complement to Bloomberg Television. So if you know Bloomberg Television, you know that it is focused on reaching a core financial and markets audience for Bloomberg. But Bloomberg Media as a whole has really expanded now to reach a wide variety of different business professionals with Bloomberg.com. And so Quick Take really is the complement in video form. We are reaching a much broader set of leaders and professionals, and specifically are focused on reaching that new generation of leaders that have risen up into positions of authority, leading teams, businesses, budgets, kind of core age group of 25 to 45, and making sure that we're really addressing their needs for understanding what's happening around the world and designing for them.
That's great. So, Jean Ellen, Bloomberg is a vast business, as you said, and it's known for many different things. Obviously, how were you able to innovate this way and continue to adopt in what would be considered a very agile way, which you just described, new media channels and etc.? How do you do that in such a huge organization such as Bloomberg, effectively and quickly?
Sure. Well, I think first it's important to just continue to identify and name the trends that are happening surrounding your business. So, the launch of Quick Take initially was in response to the kind of initial wave of concern around fake news on Twitter. And it was a kind of nice partnership and marriage, still is, between the speed of their platform and the kind of change in habits. When news breaks, people go to Twitter first now. And so recognizing that trend and recognizing that Bloomberg has something important to offer in terms of quality content in those moments. So that's kind of the first wave. And then recognizing this massive shift that we're seeing away from cable and traditional broadcast towards streaming, and that as that shift happens, people's preferred brands are going to change. And so I think if you can name those trends and recognize that they are happening kind of under your feet, then you can start to talk about how, as a business, you're going to address it. And also make sure that you're staffing in a way that kind of has people associated with tackling those trends and marshaling the traditional kind of divisions within the business to go after those new opportunities.
Yes. Well, it takes the task force and lots of project management, I assume, around that as well to make it happen, and a bright talent such as yourself to make it all push through the organization and for the quick adoption. Thank you for that. Okay, so I want to talk about the use of technology and the data and insights next. So the Washington Post is well known as a global journalism brand, but perhaps is less well known, particularly here in Europe, is that Washington Post have a complete technology arm, not only producing publishing technology products for your own company, for the Washington Post, but you license those products to other publishers around the world. So with that in mind, I have Jarrod here. Hi, Jarrod. Lovely to have you on the panel. Last but not the least, by all means, Jarrod is a VP Commercial and a founder of Zeus, which is the Post advertising software as a service arm, and Red, which is the Research and Development Lab. So, Jarrod, my question is, today, how did the Post decided to invest and innovate in this space? And how does this fit with the Post business model and the brand itself?
Yeah, so when Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post back in 2013, we really started to think about opportunities where we could kind of leverage the reputation of such a strong technology founder in order to build more opportunities for us outside of just traditional revenue streams for journalism. What was most obvious to start to venture into was to start building our own technology, to start thinking about the products that are needed to drive our journalism, reach our audiences, and what opportunities are there for us to effectively build, and not buy. We started experimenting early on with ways that we could better equip our newsroom, whether that's how we publish content, to how we manage workflow, to how we broadcast, just basically as an experiment. I mean, my background, I built content management systems for the Huffington Post and then a company called Rebel Mouse. So I know that there's a very lucrative business to be made there. And we knew that we were one of the largest newsrooms globally, so that it would be very effective for us to start investing this way. What started as a project ended up becoming a massive software as a service business called Arc Publishing, which now powers about 1,500 plus brands and publishers globally. There's a lot of publishers in the US like Dallas Morning News, Boston Globe. There's brands like BP. There's sports teams like the Golden State Warriors. But they leverage all of our software as a typical enterprise SaaS solution for them to tell better stories, reach broader audiences, and kind of reduce the overhead of investing in software teams themselves. About 3 years ago, I'd say 4 years ago, we started to think about how we could expand beyond that, right? We saw that there was huge adoption of publisher-first software for media companies and brands that are looking to reach audience. What other areas are really underserved within the media company environment? And when you think about advertising and how to build revenue streams, that is like basically like 100% not owned, whether that's the ad server, which is predominantly owned by Google, to how ads are delivered to different SSP and DSP partners. The ad tech ecosystem effectively operates completely outside of the publisher control, mainly because, very similarly to what we saw with art, publishers aren't tech companies, right? They're focusing on content, they're focusing on reaching audiences. So investing in a tech team to build your own software seems like an afterthought. On the ad tech side, it's the same. A lot of media companies, while advertising is very important to them, they're not ad tech engineering companies. They can't focus on that. So oftentimes it's overlooked and underserved, which hurts their bottom line and relationships with brands. So we decided to kind of venture into that space about 3-4 years ago, to say, in a similar fashion to how we built content management tools and workflow tools for newsrooms, how do we start to build commercial tools to help publishers drive more revenue? That business has exploded over the past, especially over the past year and a half, in two different streams. So one is we license software to publishers and websites and media companies that manages their entire advertising flow end to end. So from the wrapper to how programmatic ads and demand comes in, to how ads are delivered out of the server, really focused on viewability and speed and efficiency. And we now power well over, I think, 250 sites just over the past year of being out in market. What's been amazing is that we found that this is highly valuable for a lot of publishers because, again, viewability ties directly to higher CPMs, better performance equals better user experience, and publishers don't have to worry about this. It just works with their existing strategy. So that's been very amazing to see in market, where publishers are now building an environment that's on par, if not better, than what marketers could get on Facebook, Google AMP, and other highly effective kind of publisher applications. In about a month, we're launching a new marketplace with the aim to be competitive with Facebook and kind of other programmatic marketplaces, where all of the publishers that are on the Zeus Performance Framework effectively open up their inventory. We have a proprietary contextual targeting system that's going to power all of those publishers' inventories. So every single publisher will have their content be able to be targeted via context and consumption and have it be uniform across the entire pool. So as we edge into like a cookieless future, we're building about a, soon to be a 5 billion plus impression or monthly impression open web publisher pool that's driven purely on context. And then we're introducing a buy-side tool called Zeus Prime, where any marketer, large, medium, or small, will be able to log in, choose their ad format, choose their contextual targeting set, and then be able to deploy their inventory in real time across that entire publishing pool. So we really wanted to build an end-to-end platform that we could do in the open web that helped empower publishers and kind of enabled them to continue to be independent and focus on their business, but really invite a new kind of ecosystem that's highly performant, highly viewable, scales, 5 billion plus impressions, built on context, so unaffected by cookie, and a buy-side tool that gives marketers and advertisers the ability to buy similarly to what they do on Facebook and other platforms.
Well, that's amazing. It's interesting that, well, as you said, especially for us in Europe here, we weren't really aware of the such a services. So it's great that we have an opportunity to talk about that. I have a very quick question. You mentioned in the beginning being a part of the when Washington Post was purchased by Jeff Bezos back in 2013. That made the whole innovation process, I guess, easier for you, right? In terms of, you talked about that technology being available to you, but how on the back of that, how do you ensure that your business is at the forefront of it? How do you keep pushing that innovation game forward?
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting. So like I was early at the Huffington Post pre-AOL acquisition, and I remember we were a very technology-driven company first. I'd say even before content, we really focused on how we were discovered and distributed, and we, basically rose to the top of all the publishers by doing so. And I remember at that time, I didn't even really look at the Washington Post as a competitor. Washington Post was a very different company pre-Bezos than post-Bezos. I'd say when Bezos bought the company, of course, there were the benefits of capital, the ability to kind of invest. Many times publishers struggle because there's legacy businesses that need to be adhered to and sustained, which makes it very difficult to gamble on innovation because you have revenue streams that it's very important to maintain in terms of P&L and bottom line. And we were able to take a couple bets in a few directions. I'd say the biggest vehicle for innovation so far has been the Washington Post reputation. Like we've been able to enter these markets and compete with companies like Adobe and Google and technology companies, mainly because it came off of the reputation of the Washington Post. The Washington Post is a 100-plus-year-old brand, has pioneered in journalism or in journalistic excellence, but has also built relationships with customers, which when you think about a 100-plus-year-old relationship with customers in business, there's not many that you could think of. So that's something that I really lean on when I think about how to be innovative, to your point of like, how do you keep things connected to the core? Everything that we do, should be tethered to the Washington Post brand, but also strategically, it makes sense for us to tether it to the Washington Post brand because people trust the brand. It's already earned, right, that reputation and that promise in the ecosystem, and that's an amazing lever for us to pull when we do things. The other thing that I'd say is like, we really think of the Washington Post as a beta lab for how we innovate. We really don't start innovation outside of the Post. The Post has 100 million unique visitors per month. We're working with the top brand marketers. We have a highly engaged audience. It's an amazing breeding ground to test new concepts, whether that's products, new ways to make money, new tools and services that we could give to an audience, either, from a B2C or a B2B perspective. And everything really kind of happens in that sandbox. So we'll begin that innovation on the Washington Post, right? We'll test products out. We'll leverage kind of the environment that we have there. Oftentimes, those products will continue to exist and drive the Washington Post business. But sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll be interesting for the Post for a little bit, but maybe more effective being licensed to marketers, or maybe more effective being licensed to local news organizations like the Dallas Morning News in the United States or things like that. So we really try to kind of keep that process where Washington Post is kind of the core. We rapidly innovate there and then we fly it out.
Interesting. Going back to that point of incremental innovation, isn't it? It's building a blocks on what currently exists that works, and then finding the excellence, sort of the next project, really building on a solid foundation, such as in your case, the Washington Post brand, as you said.
Exactly. Right. It's way easier to build on top of Legos, right? If you have a Lego foundation, being able to build on top of that gives you a head start versus starting from scratch.
Right. Exactly. Great. Well, thank you very much. I have a question, which we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to read out one. This is probably more for Liam to start with. So, Liam, we have questions here. What are your expectations 12 months out, post immediate effect of demand, to solid long-term trends in the digital consumer trends versus in-store person-to-person activity?
Okay, so hopefully I've got that right. So what's the next 12 months going to be in sort of digital delivery, digital buying versus in-store? I think what's been most successful I've seen to date has been a hybrid approach of the two. I think for most brands, and I think the brands that did that pivot well in the sort of Q1, Q2 2020, it wasn't so much about let's instantly go all in on e-commerce. It was like, well, our stores are closed, so people are going to start looking for us online instead. So we need to move our budgets around, and we need to understand that we might have a slightly different type of customer now coming online versus one that goes in store. And therefore, I think you're going to see, I think that balance continue. For me, I'm stealing a quote from Rory Sutherland, so I can't claim full credit for this, but e-commerce is a fantastic way to buy 1,000 versions of one thing, not 1,000 different things. And I think that's where you see e-commerce's biggest challenge is, I've got a 9-month-old daughter, and I've started doing my grocery shopping more online than I used to. I'm lucky enough to live in a fairly central location, London. I have like 3 or 4 of the big chains on my high street. If I want to buy 3 or 4 things from a big high street chain, I can just walk down the street for 5 or 10 minutes. It's infinitely easier and convenient than ordering online. But now I've got my daughter, I do a lot more of it, and I don't like it. It's a really bad experience. Unless you're ordering a massive shop, it's much easier just to trundle down the street. So I think if you're thinking about the balance, just think about the consumer experience and think about what might be the things that people would rather buy in store than offline. I think things like, buying a small can of drink is definitely not something that's going to be an on-demand service anytime soon, because if it costs £5 to get delivered to your house and it takes half an hour to come to your house, it's not particularly convenient. It's much easier to sort of go down to the off license and buy one with cash.
Great, thank you, Liam. I have another question. Partnerships aside, what does the panel think are the most exciting opportunities for brands to be innovative in their own storytelling? Who wants to take this? I'm looking at Jean Ellen here. Jean, have you heard my question? Shall I repeat it?
So brands investing in their own storytelling.
Brands to be innovative in their own storytelling. How do you see that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've really focused on with our brand partners is helping them to think about how to tell stories across different platforms, so that they resonate there and make sense. So obviously starting on Twitter, helping brands to tell stories in a quicker way that can capture attention and that still feel editorial in nature. So the branded content, for example, that we work on with our clients should feel resonant with what we're seeing as the kind of best practices of the platform. I think as we move to streaming, one of the things I'm really excited to see brands invest in is really rethinking what the commercial space can be used for and what the commercial can be. So thinking about how that can look more like a mini story or more like a kind of mini documentary in that, 15 or 30-second spot, as opposed to something that feels more traditional. So I think there are a variety of approaches for a given brand as to whether or not they work with a publishing partner to create, whether they're partnering externally with an agency or bringing it in-house. I think all of those approaches can be valid as long as what you're working toward as the outcome is something that is really pushing the bounds and using the platform at hand to its kind of greatest possibility.
Yes, I have a question which is a bit more, if you think about plan for innovation, well, two questions really. Can you plan for innovation? Is there a structure? Is there a process? Do we design the process for innovation? And on the back of that, is this the moment for, what's the difference between the brand transformation that we talk about and innovation? How courageous brands should be at this point in time? Again, I asked three questions in one. Who's going to take the first one about difference between innovation and brand transformation? Does it actually exist?
I can have a go at this one if you like to start with. I mean, I think you have to work within a structure. You have to have a strategy. It's very interesting. Earlier in the year, Clubhouse became very popular in February, and TikTok had been, the next big thing the previous year, and obviously continues to grow in popularity. A lot of people came to me in January and February and said, should we be on Clubhouse? And nobody has said that since then to me. And it's interesting how you can be swayed by the latest thing and you can try and innovate and think that you have to adapt to everything. But actually, it's really important to stick to business goals. And our business goals are to drive referrals and to drive subscriptions. And on some platforms, it's very difficult to do that because the platforms themselves want you to stay on them and don't want you to leave. And I would say the other thing is that you can also innovate within spaces that you have already that are perhaps underused. And so again, the discussion about new platforms, well, we have 60 million followers on social media, The Economist, and we have places that we don't use at the moment. So we don't use Instagram Live, we don't use the audio-only function of Twitter Spaces, for instance. Those are places where we have existing audiences and where if we wanted to tap into innovative ways of reaching them, we could try and make more of those spaces rather than necessarily growing an audience from scratch on an untested place. So I think it's, innovation is very important, but you need to try and bring it back to your business goals or your overall strategy, because otherwise you would be experimenting all the time and you wouldn't necessarily know whether it had been worth the resources, and you wouldn't necessarily learn for the next time as to how to approach it then.
Yeah. And I'm just, the whole brand transformation versus innovation, is that the same thing, Liam?
I don't think it's quite the same thing. There is probably some crossover in terms of the initiatives that you might be doing. But when it comes to, say, brand transformation, what you're really thinking about is how you need to move your brand forward into a changing world. Whereas, and that might be things to do with price point. It might be things to do with product design. It might be things to do with distribution. I think when we're talking about innovation specifically, another way I think of it is a little bit like how Kevin described it. It's sort of business first experimentation with purpose. So we're thinking about innovation. Sometimes people say it's new stuff, which often it is. It's really about trying to understand what will happen in the future and how you can be better prepared for that. And by launching enough initiatives that give you the sort of understanding of how to combat that, and indeed how to scale it across your organization, because that's where the value really comes from. So there's definitely crossover in terms of things you might be doing. But I think certainly when it comes to innovation, you need a very different mindset versus, say, a more straightforward transformation, which is often the behind the scenes, the sort of foundations of the company, whereas innovation might be more forward thinking.
Right. Yes, I agree. Very quickly, I think I have a time for one more question to Jarrod. In our business, we always need to have our KPIs, and we need to measure them and make sure that we keep on the top of them, and etc. And it's kind of our responsibility as a marketeers to do that, whether you're on agency side or publisher side, consumers or clients, and etc. Can you actually create media innovation KPIs, and how do you actually measure it? How do you go back to a business and say these were my key KPIs that I'm trying to hit with the media innovation, given in the world that we are operating in, really, the whole disruptions?
Yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts there. I think one, to tether it to your last question, I think innovation and disruption needs to be intentional. You need to set up a culture that encourages that, right? Whether that is separate product teams or just a way to cross collaborate or bring in a lot of different ideas, right? I think if it's not intentional, then it won't happen. I've never seen a situation where there is a predominant amount of surprise and delight innovation versus intentional innovation. So that's one thing that I'd say is, if within your organization, I would always structure for that intentionally, and a way to do that is to bring a bunch of people from cross-discipline teams together. A lot of the times, non-experts, bringing in non-experts to supposed expert situations is where innovation happens. I've seen that happen time and time again at the Washington Post. Yeah. The other thing that I'd say with KPIs is that a big one, especially if innovation is coming from engineers and product teams, is for a KPI to be pushing things live, right? Not just writing out an idea, building a memo, but actually committing that code and putting it live on site and actually seeing how it performs, being able to do tests and being able to do experiments. I think innovation will get kind of chokehold in a situation of we want to do this, we're getting together, people are voting, it just kind of lives in this purgatory. And a big KPI for innovation should be, well, how many of these ideas actually went live? And you should set goals for that, whether that's 2 a month or 4 a month or 6 a month. And then you should be able to do tests, whether that's being able to test it on 5% of your audience or working with a certain partner or brand. But those KPIs, I think, are actuality KPIs, and being able to actually put these things out there in the market should be the number one thing that I think innovation teams are gold on.
I agree. But that's I guess if you think about, that's the whole live element of media innovation KPIs. It's the most exciting thing here, and also the bravest, to be honest with you. It's being able to put your grounds in the stake and say, okay, this is what I'm aiming for. That's great. Leila, we have only a few minutes left. The scale and size of the organization hinders or benefits the innovation? What do you say from where you're sitting?
I think it helps to be relatively small, as we are. You can be nimbler, but if you don't have the structures in place, particularly the cross-company structures, which Jarrod mentioned, and the data to know what you're talking about, then your culture is going to just be a creative mess. So I think that's the ideal combination. And you can also be big and very efficient, and you can also be small and very inefficient. So you need the juste milieu.
Fabulous. That's a good point, actually. Well, I think that's it for me and from our panel today. Thank you all very much for those that are sitting at home taking the time, or in the offices taking time to join us today. It's been a pleasure, my personal pleasure, to moderate this panel and meet you all. Thank you all panelists. Great conversation and great discussions. I hope you back at home have enjoyed it, and now handing over to Damian for the wrap-up.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Gordana. I just want to touch on a couple of things before then pointing out a couple of events going forward. The thing I picked up on there was, and I can say this having worked closely with Jean Ellen and at the Financial Times before that, Layla. Jarrod, you said about your brand reputation allowing you to explore and go to places, and that's something that we're experiencing now with Mark Benioff and our ownership structure, and equally experienced hugely at Bloomberg, where we were encouraged definitely to go to different places, but to validate through data, importantly. I don't think without the trust and integrity that the brands have earned over the period that they've been in market, that they would have been qualified to go to those places. So that was something that struck very closely to me, that element of trust that still is required. But then secondly, culture was the same thing that kept cropping up later, and I think you expressed that from very much so from the outset, that unless you have a culture that steps in to innovation and looks for signals in data that allows the brand to go to certain areas, you will stay rooted in your past as audience behaviors shift and move dynamically around you. So I think those are the 2 or 3 areas I picked up on for sure. But most importantly, I think your reputation and the reputation of the brands that are involved in this environment should be encouraged to try things because they will be allowed, because they've got history, a proven history of delivering. So I think that's something we need to lean into much more. Outside that, I am glad to say that the poll responses were definitive in that everybody gets their inspiration from quality journalism that's provided. That may not be a surprise given our audience, but it was nice to have that quantified. And we look forward to everybody kind of coming back to join us in our moment of celebration, which is going to be in September, when we've been through the judging of all the World Media Group Awards. And actually, hopefully, we'll celebrate many of the innovative partnerships all of our brands have worked on with their clients over the past 12 months, which has really been a period which has challenged us to be at our most innovative. So hopefully we'll see the sharp edge of that. But again, to Gordana's point, thank you to everybody who's given up their time to come and talk to us today. And we'll check in over the course of the summer and certainly see everybody for that celebratory moment over in September. So thanks again. And we'll check out there and speak to everybody shortly. Thanks, guys.